want to start by asking a kind of a hypothetical question. If I asked everyone in this room whether you were conservative or progressive, I would guess that 80 to 90% of you would answer one way. Am I right? Most of us, without thinking, would answer that we're more conservative than we are progressive, because that's kind of part of Christianity, right? No. For many reasons. For starters, those minds are political words in our mind. Those words are political words when we think about them, aren't they? They're not political words. They're philosophical words that have been purposefully hijacked. Now, words change over time. There's nothing wrong about that. It's actually a good thing. You think about the word like album, for instance. Back in the 40s, an album meant something, and today an album means something else, and it would be a useless word if it was still the same today. Words change, and that's good, but some words get hijacked, and they get hijacked on purpose. We're not going to go into the purpose that these two words were hijacked today, but it's basically to keep camps of people and get money and votes and power. But that's the basics behind it. But those words are purposefully misused. So today, I want to talk about these two terms. Not their political meaning, but their real philosophical meaning. And I think you'll be surprised at some assumptions that you have. I also want to show that today, specifically today, has significance to this topic. Just last evening, ended the Passover festival, the feast commemorating God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt, their 430 years of slavery. We all know the story. God spent about 80 years getting everything ready. He prepared a person for it, taught that person, got everything ready. And in summary, God frees an entire group of people, a nation inside of a nation. He starts to bring them out of slavery into a rich and beautiful land, a promised land. He's going to make a special people out of them, his special people. They leave Egypt. He leads them out, performing miracle after miracle. And then just really a matter of days later, they're at the Jordan River. You can count the time in days. It's not that long. They're at the Jordan River, the threshold of the promised land, and they stop. God then, enraged by their rejection, curses them to wander and die in the wilderness. 40 years. It's a weird ending to that story. Leaves a lot of questions. We know, of course, about the holy days. We're pretty good at the symbolism. We could probably be exaggerating a little bit, but we could probably all say we know all the details about all the symbolism. We've lived the symbolism many times. We know the blood and the bread and the wine and the unleavened bread. We got all of these details. Do we know why the story ended that way? What's the point of that story ending that way? Back to our two words. Conservative and progressive. The world around us is changing all the time. But the majority of religious people, and this is across most faiths, the majority of religious people in most faiths consider themselves conservative. The word conserve means to keep or to protect or to hold. That's the technical idea of conserving. But the practical application is something completely different. And this is where the word's kind of been hijacked. The practical application of conservatism, as we in this room and in this age think of the word, is something more along the lines of getting back to the good old days. Sort of like Merle Haggard's song, I wish a buck was still silver. It was back when the country was strong. That application of getting back to the basics, you've heard that before. This is a fundamental aspect of the ideology that the churches of God profess. We've all heard terms like apostolic Christianity, like returning to original Christianity, back to basics, or even, I'll try not to roll my eyes, the trunk of the tree, because it gets overused. In a snippet of 1 Thessalonians 5, as well as some other scriptures, get used as a proof text for this idea, because Paul says, hold fast to what is good. So today I challenge you to explore this topic with me and see if the idea of conservatism in its practical application, as we know it today, is a biblical concept. I'm going to do that by asking you a series of questions, and Carl's already upset with me for this, but I'm going to ask you a series of questions and not give you the answer, because I want you to think about them. I can't tell you what I think about them. That's literally propaganda. So we're going to ask these questions, highlight some biblical stories, and hopefully I'll put an earworm in your head, and you'll have to think about these. You'll have to come up with an answer in your own mind. The title today, if you like titles, is Can You Be a Conservative Christian? First question, with no answer, mind you. What part of human society do you want to conserve? It's kind of a big question. Most people don't get asked that question. Some of the most common points of political conservatism, at least in the West, have to do with returning the United States to a Christian republic, putting prayers back in school, putting the 10 Commandments back in courthouses, returning Judeo-Christian ethics to business and law. Of course, we all love those things. Those are great things. We have nothing to argue about. Have those things ever existed, though? Have we ever actually had those things? We've tried them, little bits here and there. But have we ever had a point in history where we did those things so well that we should say, that's it, we did it. Let's write it in stone and continue doing it this way forever. Do you know that the 10 Commandments were carved in marble in the hall of the Supreme Court in 1978 during Roe versus Wade? They were there. Do you know that even to this day, that adultery is illegal and punishable with jail time in Washington, D.C.? As for Judeo-Christian ethics, I finally said it that time, that's a hard one. Have you ever looked down the list of owners of the largest CEOs and businesses in the United States and looked at their last names? We're not without. Now, assuming Ezekiel 28 is talking about the fall of Lucifer into Satan, right? It's very convincing, but if that's what it's talking about, when was the fall of Satan? Was it before or after man-made civilization? We don't even need to use those assumptions, because we can look back and really question, has any human society ever actually been righteous? I'm not suggesting at all that nothing good has ever happened. But have we achieved the pinnacle of righteousness? Have we gotten it perfect? When Paul says, approve all things and hold fast to what is good, does that not imply that what's not good needs to be let go? So just what part do you want to save? Because if it's only the good bits, which I think we all agree that we only want to save the good bits, you can't do that by staying in the same place. You have to progress. Second question. Where is the ultimate good in the Christian adventure? Is it behind you or is it in front of you? I'm of both the kingdom now and a kingdom later persuasion. Vance knows the word for that. I don't know the word for that. But besides that, there's clear evidence in the Bible that the ultimate good is in front of us. It's something that we're trying to get to. What do we do if something... What do we do if there's something that we want and we don't have it yet? We move towards it. If you're somewhere and where you want to be is somewhere else, you have to get up. You have to go there. You have to go on that journey. In your own lives, we all have problems, don't we? There's things we want to fix. Do we have all knowledge and all skill? I don't. The answer and the fixes to those problems that we have and the things that we need to fix and reorient, we don't have them. They're in front of us. We have to keep going towards them. The process looks like taking what you've known, adding to it, sorting through it, and processing it. Even the human existence is a process. You're born as an infant. Don't have any control over your fingers. You have to find your toes. Can't control any urges. And then you start learning. We call that process maturity. We understand that process. We understand that we do that. What about God? Can God mature? Does the pattern that we were modeled after not do the same thing? Is that not something that we have in common? So, if God is conservative, as we use the word, would we exist? Didn't he have perfection before us? Didn't he exist before sin? So for God, the concept of getting back to the good old days doesn't fit, because he had the good old days. And yet he still moved forward. And he on purpose, you might say, but he created something that turned into a mess. Like we can all look in the mirror. Third question. Are we supposed to prove all things or prove some things? Most of you here know that I'm a psychology nut. It's one of my favorite things to study, so I'm going to riff on an idea for a second here. It's an indisputable fact that new knowledge is impossible to avoid. We don't exist in a vacuum, and just by existing, we come into possession of new information. We have to do something with it. We're sentient beings, and we have a few options. We can process it, we can consider it, we can take it apart. We can also just shelve it. But we have to do something. The beginning of the 20th century, about 1900, religion and education, politics, business, all those fields, those large fields, they all had a certain amount of momentum. For roughly 100 years or so, things were the way they are. They were the way they were. Like, we do this, then we do this, and then we do this. And there was a decent amount of momentum. It had been upset here or there, but there was a pretty good, even flow. And then technology exploded. In World War I, the Dust Bowl, Depression, World War II, the nuclear age, and the Cold War. All those things happened in 50 years. And the world from 1900 to 1950 is almost unrecognizable in the difference. There was an entire palette of new information, new circumstances, new nations. There were masses of displaced peoples and refugees. There were new diseases. There were, obviously new technologies, cars and airplane travel. There were new animosities, new hatreds, some of them rightly earned, some of them not. New memories. It's kind of an important thing. And society had all of this to work with. And despite how badly adaptation was implemented, business, politics, education, all adapted. The housing market boomed because there were people that needed houses, so business filled all these gaps and retooled. Politics retooled to new demographics. Education retooled to new memories. But religion didn't. Religion didn't adapt. Especially Christianity. In fact, you can make the case that religion, and specifically Christianity, doubled down. During that 50 years, fundamentalist groups sprung up all over the globe. These get back to basics, and this is important. And the black and white, the very strict. Us today, here in this room, we're descended from that time period. We come from that getting back after there was so much chaos. So in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, you can turn there with me. This is often used as a proof text, so we're going to give it some attention. We're just going to give this one verse attention because it's only used as a proof text and it's one verse. It has a lot of important context, but it's not used that way. So we'll just answer according to what's offered. 1 Corinthians 5:21. But test everything, or prove everything in King James Version, and hold fast to what is good. What does it mean to prove all things and hold fast to what is good? There's a few things that it means. First, the statement implies that all things have to be considered. You can't shelve knowledge. You have to consider it. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but you have to consider that knowledge. Next, it implies that a distinction has to be made. You have to be able to discern what you're looking at. You have to be able to tell what's good and what's evil, or bad, wrong, whatever binary option that you're considering there, whatever metric you're using. And thirdly, it implies that you have to discard anything that's not good. In my last message here, I made the case that the Bible was written in a language that we don't speak anymore. And a few weeks after that, Blake mentioned that the Bible was written for you, but not to you. At risk of sounding like a broken record, the Bible was written in a different time and place and culture. There are things that didn't exist then, that exist now, that have to be reckoned with. That in no way means that we should become a church that just allows everything. We can't do away with right and wrong, as lots of humanist groups try to do today. We can't just be accepting of everything as equally okay, as the postmodern idea is, that every idea is equally valid. But what it does mean is that we can't stay the same, because we don't have it yet. We're not there yet. We have to process every new circumstance and situation, pick out what's good, and dispense with what isn't. If we hold on to what we currently have, or what we had in 1983, or what we had in AD 83, we can hold fast to that, but we'd be holding fast to imperfection. I'll show you how that works. Here's two examples of things that the churches of God, specifically down from Mr. Armstrong, because that's our lineage, two things that we've been conservative in, and I think you'll see a problem that comes when we talk about them. The first concept is the idea of discernment. Discernment is the ability to tell the difference between two things, or to differentiate between different things. All joking aside, we're horrible at it. It's not a skill set that most of us have, and we weren't taught it. Not to put all the blame on him, obviously, because we all share it. But Mr. Armstrong had a Quaker background, very strict, very black and white. And he lived during one of, we call it the black and white era for TV reasons, but it was the black and white era for way more than just TV. Doesn't take a whole lot of reading of his letters and autobiography and sermons and things like that to find that the man did not preach nuance. That was not his forte. In his writing, at least, he may have believed differently, but in his writing, there's two trees, there's black and white, there's good and evil, there's right and wrong, there's left and right, and there's nothing in the middle of any of those. It's just a binary option. We call that dogma today. We joke about it because it's funny, because it doesn't fit in our world. We make characters of cowboys saying it's my way or the highway. It's funny because it doesn't fit. But this is where we come from. We have to keep this in mind. Because of, at least in conjunction with, that black and white view, we weren't taught about discernment. Right and wrong are eternal concepts. That can't be undone. But the world's not static. Situations aren't static. The world of Mr. Armstrong is a different world than we live in today. So many things exist today that just didn't exist back then. Back when the Worldwide Church of God made determinations on things, what activities were right or wrong. And in many cases, we were taught to, not everyone, but at least in my background and many others, we were taught to get a determination. You ask up and get a determination on things. And that's the antithesis of discernment. Because rather than to discern for ourselves. We were taught to defer to authority. 100 years later, and we kind of joke about it, that all the different groups of which we're all parts of, we joke about how authoritarian this one is and how liberal this one is, because we recognize that deference to authority is something that we have in our teaching. It's where we come from. And we've conserved, in many ways, that black and white view of the world, that binary right, wrong, black, white, and nothing in the middle. Hebrews 5:11, if you'll turn there with me. Here's the fire and brimstone. Hebrews 5:11. And try to think about this as you're who the letter's being written to, not who's writing the letter. About this, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain. Since you have become dull of hearing, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk and not solid food, for everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. The authors of Hebrews here say in effect, I'm trying to teach you something, and you can't discern. Conserving a belief that every issue is black and white and needs to be deferred to authority is an obstacle to being a Christian. It's interesting, those of us here in this room have less deference to authority in some cases than many other groups, but we have a common ancestry. And I know many of my close friends on the other side of the camera who are still in authoritarian groups and have a background like me and very, very, very strict in authoritarian groups. And that's an obstacle. Because we've continued to fail at discernment, here's something else. Over the past couple of years, because of the work that I do in antique architecture restoration, I ended up working with a lot of homosexuals. For some reason, in that field, there's a lot of homosexuals. Because of our working relationship, we spend a lot of time in conversation. And as my custom is, every conversation that I have control over, I kind of maneuver into more important things than business. And curiously, I found a whole lot of things that they all have in common. 3 specifically. It's an unbroken rule in all my acquaintances. Might not be a global or a universal rule, but I've never once had it proven wrong. 3 things that the homosexual community have in common. A religious upbringing and a desire to be moral. Looks different for, every denomination that they were raised in. But every single time, they have a religious background and a strong desire to still be moral. Secondly, they were unimpressed with churches. They found churches impotent and unable to offer anything of value. But as an aside there, just think about back to Christ walking by Peter, 30-year-old married man with a business in a time when there was no social security and no welfare, dropped his nets to follow Jesus. Like, Jesus had something to offer, something that was compelling enough for a middle-aged man with a family to drop his job. But this community has found that churches have nothing like that to offer. And third, they rebelled against what's normal and appropriate because of blatant hypocrisy in religion. It's easy for us in this room, in the churches of God in general, to think, that's really interesting. Shelf that information. After all, the Bible says homosexuality is a sin. That's that. I really want to challenge that assumption today. I'm not going to, by any means, say that homosexuality is not a sin, but let's challenge that assumption that that's the end of the story. We, in the COGs, do exhibit hypocrisy about sins like that. For some reason, we think some sins are worse than others. Is homosexuality worse than adultery? It's worse than having children out of wedlock? Worse than slander? Forcibly divorcing people? Is it worse than all those things? Do we not have some skeletons? Now, we love mercy for us. We're very thankful that God didn't say, nope, these people are done. And for those of us who have kids, have our children ever done something that we're like, nope, you're done? My children have done some pretty horrible things, and that's never a thought. So, why is it a habit that we have to write off this population as lost? Most of you know I travel around churches a lot. And in all of my experiences and all the groups that I've participated in and visited, not a single one to my knowledge, please prove me wrong, has a single program aimed at offering help to that part of society. In fact, at least where I come from, they've doubled down that it's just a sin. Radio, TV, and magazines just condemn the sin and offer no hope for the sinner. Is it wrong? Yes. Yes. Is all we have to offer condemnation? Have we not decided in practice to preach the gospel to the whole world except? There's a trait that you can pick out about God that's consistent through all the stories about him in the Bible. That's that he speaks your language. It's not the other way around. Think about the first Pentecost. Peter preaches, and dozens of ethnic groups and races hear the gospel in their own language. It's very, very clear in the passage that it's that way and not the other way around. There's several denominations today, that want to speak in tongues as if there's some sort of special language that God speaks in, but it's completely unbiblical. God speaks in your language. And he gives you instruction and correction according to your own culture. You can find that through all the stories. He didn't speak Greek to the Romans, and he meets you where you are and teaches you according to what you understand. So what about homosexuality What about the homosexual community in 2022? Do we write them off as lost souls? Obviously, we can't make a come and stay as you are policy. That would be ignoring the pages of our Bible. We can't rip out the pages that talk about that, like a lot of humanistic churches are doing. We can't do that. We've got to progress. We have to leave a black and white view and figure out how to reach. We have to practice discernment. And be warned, if we do this, I've noticed this myself as I've tried to reach out to this community because I'm in it or associated with it. You're going to get it wrong. From time to time, you'll be able to look back and go, we could have done that better. But that's because you're moving. It's because you're getting closer. So, there's a growing population of people in the world. And it's kind of exploding. It's still very, very small, but it's exploding. And if we don't reach them, they might be lost souls in this life. Could be. And who's to say that's not on us? That's just two things. That's just two examples that are pertinent to me because, like the old Spokesman's Club manual for the attack speech, those really grind my gears. But what else? What else do we hold on to when we hold on to the bad and the good? Fourth question. Why did Israel have to wander in the desert for 40 years? I told you there's a connection between today and this idea. Here it is. Today is the day after the Passover festival. God led Israel out of Egypt, not by their might, but by divine interference and intervention. They were freed from slavery, not just of slave labor like we kind of assume, but hunger, constant threat of infanticide, poverty. They're freed from all those things. The night before, they were led out. Every firstborn of man and animal died, except theirs. By the symbolic blood of the Passover lamb, those physical lives were extended by not being cut short. They were the exception in this. There was a price, and they were accepted from the price. That could have been the whole story. God could have just wiped Egypt out. Wouldn't have been that difficult. That's not the story. Because God frees them and brings them directly into the desert. It wasn't an accident of planning. There's actually a lot of philosophical meaning to that and psychological meaning. Because the second that you leave the known, you're in the unknown. You're in the desert, and you don't know what's there. You've left everything that you know. Like Abraham, who had to leave and go somewhere he didn't know, they did. If you're attentive, the first thing you notice when you notice something new is that you don't know anything. You see someone playing a sport or something that looks interesting. The first thing you notice is that you don't know anything about that sport. And you have to go learn about that sport. You're painfully aware of it. Because anytime there's something that catches your attention, you're going to be up that night, Googling everything you can about it, learning about it. I don't know. So it's just a fact of life that if you're going to move from any place to any other place, it's not you leave this place and you get to that place. You leave that place, you cross the desert, and then you find that place. So, just like Abraham, they left. And then, as Paul reckons, God baptized them, took them through the waters of the Red Sea, and they crossed the desert and met God. Literally met God. He offered them a covenant there. He offered them the same covenant he gave Abraham 480 years earlier. But they rejected that covenant. That got expensive too, because God had already paid the down payment for that, and he said, you owe me your firstborn now. But they rejected that covenant. They said, we don't want to talk to you. We want you to talk to Moses, and then we'll listen to Moses. So, frustrated, and I read through that story sometime. You can feel the sweat like running down God's forehead during some of those instances. But he offers them a far inferior covenant. Like, the only promise is you get land. Like, you can stay alive and keep some property. They grudgingly accept that. So they spend a few days. I'm summarizing this. They spend a few days. They build all the devices for this covenant. And they march out to get what's coming to them. Like, we're going to get our promise. Mere days after leaving slavery, experiencing miracles, crossing the desert, meeting God, they arrive at the Jordan, the threshold of the promised land. And there they are, freed, sanctified, led, promised. What do? They send in spies because it might not be safe to keep going. The spies go in and they search the land. And indeed, God was right. It's flowing with milk and honey. There's food. It's beautiful. It's abundant. It's healthy. It's beautiful. But there's giants. And there's walled cities. And there's beasts. So the spies, except two, come back. They give the people a bad report. And they say something really interesting. They say, we're not able to bear it. Can you imagine? What if they just gone through? Do they think that was them? Do we think it was us who brought us to this point that we are today? But there they say, we can't bear it. And the people have a mental breakdown. In modern terms, they lose it. They lose all hope. They lost perspective. They forgot their history. They lost all their anticipation of the greatness that was promised to them. They just break down. That, mind you, is the third time that they rejected God in those just few days. The first time was right at the Red Sea. They made a delegation to go back to Egypt. That was Korah's rebellion. God opens the earth, swallows them. It's first rejection. They get to Sinai. God offers them the Abrahamic covenant, and they say no. Second. They get to Jordan, and they say, we can't do it. It's just 3 times right there, in a matter of days, in the midst of, they said we can't bear it, while the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire were still up. And just think about that context. And then think about us. We know it wasn't us who brought us to the truth. We all have the stories of something unusual. So God says, in effect, that's it. I've tried and I've tried and I've tried, and I gave you opportunity after opportunity, and you reject it. Paul adds some color to this, and some of the translations get really colorful on this. But I love it. 1 Corinthians 10:5, he says, "For God was not pleased with them and left their bodies scattered in the wilderness." They didn't even get tombs. Like, they're just out there. They spent 40 years wandering in the desert. Not because that was the plan. That was never the plan. They spent 40 years wandering in the desert because they rejected the plan. What about you and me today? We just finished this festival season. We experienced the symbolism of debt being paid. We've experienced the symbolism of getting sin out and putting righteousness in. We've experienced the symbolism of leaving Egypt. Then we've also, on top of those symbols, we've participated in another covenant of blood. We've taken of the bread and the wine. We've said that Christ's life will be our life, and Christ's death will be our death, and Christ's resurrection will be our resurrection. We've taken part in him. That covenant includes the command to love our brothers as Jesus loved us. It also includes the command to go into the world and preach the gospel to every creature. The very night that he instituted those symbols, he prayed that we wouldn't be taken out of the world, but that we would be protected and empowered in it. Despite all the good that has come from our history, our church history, and I have nothing bad to say about it. I know my wife because of this. Most of you know each other because of this. But despite all that good, we have been strongly taught the concept that the world is dangerous, and so we need to stick together and stay out of the world and isolate. We've just really been taught a lot of isolationism. Some of us have moved past that to other, more or less an extent, but we were all fed that. I have friends who are terrified of the world. For them, it's dangerous. It's just too dangerous. Someone might tell you something that might cause you to question. That's a real fear. And you know what? The world is a dangerous place. Very. There's giants in the world today. There's political and financial giants. They have strength and influence far more than any of us put together can fight. There's high fortified and walled cities, like culture and politics, and bureaucracy. You and I, as individuals, can't fight that. Certainly not and win. There are beasts. There are subtle ideas and distractions. But that's not all there is out there. John 4, verse 31. Read this with me. John 4, 31. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you don't know about." So the disciples talked amongst themselves and said, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" And he said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." Don't you say there's 4 months before the harvest? Look up. Are the fields not ripe for harvest? Very interesting statement here he goes into. He says, "Lift up your eyes and see that the fields are already white for harvest. Already the one who reaps," this is 2,000 years ago, "already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life." so that the sower and the reaper may rejoice together. For here is the saying that holds true, that one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for what you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. So the fields are ripe for harvest in the world. Where is that field? Matthew 28. Matthew 28, verse 18. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them into the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And it doesn't end there. The very next sentence. Behold, I am with you. The wandering in the wilderness happened because Israel would not progress. They were content to be miserable as long as they didn't have to change. So many groups today want to hold on to the past. Sayings like, we just need to prepare the bride. Or just stick to the trunk of the tree, because if you go out on twiggy doctrines, you'll fall out of the tree. Or we have to hold on to the faith once and for all delivered. It's not the offer that was given to us. We have a mission. Our mission is in the world. Not to be the world, but to be in it, producing fruit in the world. Just like Israel was supposed to cross that Jordan and be a model nation, an example. Not by our might, but by grace only, by God's grace. Our debts paid, our chains have been loosened. We too are figuratively at the threshold. We had all those symbols yesterday. Here we are, the very next day. Our mission is in front of us. Are we too scared to accept it? Matthew 25. We'll close pretty quickly here. Matthew 25. I didn't save this one up. I got to pull it up. Matthew 25 and verse, oh goodness. Tabby told me this would happen if I used my laptop for notes. Matthew 25:14. This is a very familiar. Let me switch translations here. She is going to eat my lunch when she sees this. Matthew 25:14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called all of his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold. To another he gave 1 bag. Or to another 2, and to another 1. Each according to his own ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work trading it, and gained 5 bags more. So also the man who had 2 bags gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went and dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned to settle accounts with them. The one who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5 and said, Master, you entrusted me with these 5 bags of gold. See, I've gained 5 more. The man with 2 bags did the same thing. Said, you entrusted me with 2. Here's 2 more. His master replied to them, well done, good and faithful servants. You have been faithful with few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Then the man who had received the 1 bag of gold came, said, Master, I know you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out, and I hid your gold in the ground. Here's what belongs to you. The master replied, you wicked and lazy servant, you know that I harvest where I have not sown. Why then did you not put my money in the bank at least, where I could get some interest? So take the bag of gold from him who gave it from him and give it to the one who has 10. You ever heard the business expression, you have to spend money to make money? It's very true. That first servant with 5, he went out immediately and traded with it. It was a big risk. You know what happens when you start a business on investments? You know, you get an investor. That's a big risk. But he did it. And he did it because he had faith in the concept that the master was more about business than money. The master wanted business done. And so he took risks. And they paid off. Sometimes risks don't pay off. That's why you got to be discerning. The other servant who buried the money. It's easy to look at this parable and think that it's really harsh. Like he just made a mistake. It's not just a mistake. He missed the entire purpose of his existence. The only reason a servant exists is to do the master's work. That's the whole job. And by not doing the master's work, he rejected the actual reason he exists in the story. We have a work to do. We have the tools. We have the money. We even have the assurance that God is with us. We have the down payment of this covenant. We have the Holy Spirit. I'll leave you on one last scripture. Numbers 13. Numbers 13, verse 30. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once, for we are well able to overcome it.